tariffs?
Our book, Solving the Crises of Capitalism and Democracy, argues that imposing tariffs to solve a very real problem is the wrong approach for a whole series of reasons. Let's first of all start with it's a real problem that we have a trade deficit. The trade deficit reached about $1 trillion last year, but the really important point of that is that most of that, or almost half of it, I should say, was involved in high-tech products. So imposing tariffs and trying to move, let's say, the automobile industry back into the United States, which has been much talked about recently as a reason for tariffs, doesn't solve the real problem. The real problem is a lack of radical innovation. Now, this may shock everyone. Everyone thinks the United States is an innovative country. And it's true, we have Apple and Alphabet and Meta and some of these other high-tech companies. But in reality, when push comes to shove, the really important measure is, do we have a surplus in high-tech products? And the answer is no, we don't. Furthermore, it isn't only an absence of a surplus of trade in high-tech products. It is that there's been a steady decline in breakthrough research as measured by cross-references in recently published data. So not only is our competitiveness going down from the standpoint of products that gather money on the marketplace, but it's also going down in terms of high-tech research. And of course, one doesn't need to comment about all the cuts to science recently to realize that it's just going to make a bad problem worse. Now, why is radical innovation so important? The reason goes back to Piketty's criticism of capitalism and how it is creating more and more inequality since the 1980s. And he has a formula in there, and we don't need to go into R&G, but what the formula really says in practical, concrete terms is if the economy grows fast enough, then, and that usually means 4 to 5%, then under those circumstances, unemployment becomes stable, salaries increase, as well as the profits of the companies. So, therefore, if we want more equality rather than inequality, we have to radically increase the rate growth of the economy, and that is done through radical product and process innovation.
Radical product and process innovation are innovations, changes that lead to changes in organizations and in sectors of the economy and in the economy. These changes can come about at various stages of the production process. So it can be fundamental innovations in the underlying technologies of things, basic scientific discoveries. It can be innovations that in the way in which you apply these things to different products, leading to new products or new functions for products, or improvements in products that in the way of fewer externalities to the products. That means improvements to the environmental consequences with fewer resources going into the development of the process, less pollution, or more efficiency in the production of them. And in the process part of it, it's new production technologies that reduce the cost of producing products, or reduce the cost of packaging and distributing them, or in the advertisement and distribution of them. All of these things are areas in which there can be radical improvements.
Well, in the book, Bill and I argue that what you have to do is to recognize that market competition won't do it. And you need a new form of societal coordination, which for brand purposes we are calling SEONs, but that is just meaning systemic, coordinated interorganizational networks. And I'll give you an example that's relevant for radical product innovation, namely, what would be a SEON in this area? And to pick up on what Bill says, a SEON would put together basic research, applied research, product development, manufacturing research, quality research, and consumer research. Now, 100 years ago, all those functions were combined in a single department, like when GE or Procter & Gamble was innovating a radical product innovation. And by the way, both of those firms created many radical product innovations in the course of the first part of the 20th century. But nowadays, as knowledge has grown, this process has gotten much more complex. And specialized organizations work. So we have scientific laboratories that do the basic research. We have spin-offs from university departments that do the applied research. There's even specialized companies that try to help some of the spin-offs, like they're called hubs. Then the manufacturing companies are primarily just concerned with doing manufacturing research. Now, the difficulty is that each of these specialized organizations doesn't communicate well with the others. They develop their own tacit knowledge and their own way of understanding things. So, for example, when biotech came along, the pharmaceutical companies didn't know how to speak to the biotech companies because their model was chemistry, not biology. So a SEON comes along and creates a platform in which this communication can occur along what I call the idea innovation network. Basic research is also communicating with people who are involved in consumer research. And by the way, that would handle one of the breakdowns. We don't develop products that are safe for the environment, as Henderson points out in her book, and a critique of capitalism. And in these platforms, gradually the tacit knowledge of each of these different ways of thinking is understood, and they communicate better, and that will then lead to radical product innovations.
The premier example in the United States of a SEON is Semitech. Semitech was a collaboration among the leaders in the production of semiconductors. Semiconductors were invented in the United States in the 1950s, and they're an example of the advantage of the United States in basic scientific research. And then over the course of the 1960s, the semiconductors were built into microchips that became useful products. And eventually we all know them as cell phones, iPads, tablets, and personal computers. These being close to the top of the heap in the production of semiconductors. Intel Corporation and other corporations producing semiconductors by the 1980s were leaders in the world and dominated the market. But by 1990, they had lost their share of the market to the Japanese. And this is a reflection of a problem that's fairly common in American industry. Is we do very well in fundamental science, but we do less well in the translation of fundamental science discoveries into useful products, and then useful products into manufacturing and consumer products in the consumer dimension. So in order to compete with the Japanese, the Defense Department, with support from the Defense Department, the industry organized, the various leaders of the industry contributed funds and staff, key staff, technical staff, to Semitech, and together they found new technologies for production. They made radical innovations in production processes. and in the design of products and in the manufacturing of products. And by the mid-1990s, they were able to take back a substantial share of the semiconductor industry. And now we see a need for doing it again, because it turns out that the Taiwanese have again come to dominate the semiconductor industry, and leading companies like Intel are now lagging in the industry.
Well, as Bill's discussion of Symatech indicates, they're quicker, faster, and better. And that's very important in a competitive situation. And I've explained already one of the reasons why they're quicker, and that's because we solve the communication problems going on between the different organizations because of tacit knowledge. But that's not the only obstacle that really results in SEONs being necessary to have radical product and process innovation. Another problem is, and this is what people don't recognize, it isn't the market that's making decisions, it's the managers in the companies. And many of them choose not to be competitive. That is to say, their sales may go down and they keep on doing the same thing. They're risk averse, and they're risk averse for a series of reasons. One reason is in order to be innovative, they may have to add new occupations and specialties, areas of expertise that they don't have, and that upsets the power hierarchy and the status hierarchy, and they don't want to do that. Secondly, to be successful at radical process innovation, you have to be willing to take big risks. And managers are risk averse. They're afraid of losing their jobs. So SEONs solve this, if you will, weakness on the part of managers by putting them all together, and as from these different organizations, and as they discuss this, they develop, if you will, the spine to become more risk-taking.
Well, the strongest evidence we have comes from our previous book on society saving themselves, which contains a study of a SEON in Nicaragua. The SEON was called Nica Salud, and it is the name of both the coordinating organization and the network. And this came about because there was a hurricane that came in over the Caribbean and sat over Honduras and Nicaragua for 5 days and rained 7 feet of rain.
That was Hurricane Mitch, right?
Yeah, Hurricane Mitch. And it it washed out roads and bridges and the basic infrastructure of a lot of communities, especially in the highland areas in Nicaragua. So they got $6 million were approved by U.S. Congress to be given through USAID to a consortium of international NGOs. Now this was to be an innovation in the management of grant money, because AID felt they didn't have the management resources to deal with all of these NGOs independently. They wanted to create some other kind of organization to manage the large-scale projects like that. So that was part of the grant, was that there were 7 or 9 international NGOs that were to participate in this, and they were to form a network, and they were to create a network coordinating organization. Then they were to recruit local NGOs that were working in the more remote and mountainous areas in Nicaragua. And together, they worked to rebuild the infrastructure for maternal and child health. So the objectives were to improve outcomes from birth outcomes for mothers and improve survival and health of young children, infants and young children in Nicaragua. The evaluation component of that included before and after surveys. They did 3 surveys in 1999, 2000, and 2001, so that they were able to measure the current practices at the beginning of the survey, and during the survey, and after the survey. And they were able to document significant progress. And then Jerry came in and did an evaluation of how was this progress achieved. And it was achieved substantially because of the coordinating organization. The coordinating organization brought these NGOs, the leaders of the NGOs made up the coordinating organization. They got together for regular meetings and exchanged information. And together, by looking at the results of the surveys, they discovered where they were weakest, and they discovered who was it that knew how to address the weaknesses, so that they could then pass that information along and people could change their practices to adopt more effective ones. And the result was that over the course of 3 years, they made substantial progress, meaning at least a 10% improvement, and some of them were vastly more than that, in the various indicators over maternal health care and child health. So this is the basic evidence, and in our book, we expand on the theoretical basis for it and look at what were the particular aspects of the program that were particularly effective for which problems. And it turns out that it's very complicated. There's no one solution to all the problems. Each different problem has a different combination, and some of the things that were effective were like local health committees. And there were 2 different kinds of the local health committees, but that's just the detail. So that the local health committees and the different kinds of health specialists that were in the field to conduct training programs, education programs, and technical assistance that went out teaching mothers how to prepare oral rehydration salts, which is a therapy for child diarrhea. The innovations that were introduced were largely prepared and created through programs through the World Health Organization for solving these maternal health and infant health, child health problems in developing countries.
So 25 years later, what is the status of that whole project?
Well, that was one of the most interesting things we discovered is when we went back to look at the organization. Nico Salud, the coordinating organization, still exists. And some of the NGO organizations are still members. I mean, a lot of them have left and dropped out, and a lot of new ones have joined. It's a much bigger organization now than it was then. But it still exists and is still working to improve the health of people in Nicaragua.
Well, if we advertise them not as a scion, but as an objective to create radical innovation, then it becomes a much easier sell. What's not to like? With radical innovation, we get faster economic growth, higher wages, better profits, more stable employment. So with that, you can convince both the left and the right that this is a good deal, and they're likely to support it. And the economic elites are not likely to be opposed because they see it as a way of getting more profits. So I think, and yet, in the book, of course, we're interested in radical innovation because it will increase equality, but we're not going to sell it in terms of equality because that would be a no-no, clearly under the present circumstances.
Now, Jerry has spoken specifically toward the economic advantages of it. Scions can also address social problems. So one of the scions we have proposed is to look at a balance between freedom and order in communities. And these are particularly knotty problems that people have been struggling with for decades. But we are hopeful that if you could build scions to sort of take these problems apart and start with pieces of them that you could build up toward working at the larger problems of rebuilding local communities that have that have been struggling in the current social and economic conditions. There have been a lot of changes that have undermined the organization and the solidarity of local communities. And Scions is a way of rebuilding leadership in the communities, of bringing competing interests together to find out the things that, to discover the things they have in common and the things they share, and to get people working together. An example of that is the problem of hunger, for instance. Is people recognize that there's a problem of hunger, but nobody's really working on that in a way that's very productive. You have things like food banks, and food banks are tremendously important, and they're doing a wonderful job. But they're not solving the problem of hunger. They're addressing the symptom of hunger, that people are hungry. But they're not providing people with the resources and the means of full participation in the economy and the ability to support themselves. And so this is an enormously complicated problem involving farmers and the distribution systems, the marketing systems, the production of manufactured foods, and the whole nutrition industry is a huge industry in this country, but it's not solving the problem of hunger. So if you put together a Scion to address this issue and support those activities that represent fundamental solutions to the problem, that would be real progress.